Hello and welcome to a program on assessing healthcare innovations that we're delighted to put together with the Peterson Health Technology Institute. I am Steven Collens. I'm the CEO of MATTER. Our mission is to accelerate the pace of change of healthcare, and we do a few things to advance that purpose. We run an incubator for healthcare startups. We launched in 2015, and since then we've worked with about 1,000 companies from around the world. They range from very early to growth stage startups. In aggregate, they've raised a little over $5 billion to fuel their growth. We also run accelerators, about 6 to 8 a year, all in partnership with large health systems and life sciences companies and payers and associations. We are currently in the middle of one in partnership with HCSC, Organon, Stryker, University of Chicago Medicine, Baycare, Parkview Health, and the Laerdal Million Lives Fund that is all focused around solutions to improve maternal health in the United States. We also work with large enterprises to help them build their innovation capabilities. We have a suite of education and training and insight services that help them kind of make sense of emerging technologies and figure out how to harness them. And finally, we're a nexus for people who are passionate about healthcare innovation. We bring people together to be inspired and learn and connect with each other and have conversations that advance and develop their thinking about the role of innovation in improving health and advancing change in healthcare. And so in that vein, we are really happy to be able to work with the Peterson Health Technology Institute on this conversation on assessing novel technologies. We have Caroline Pearson with us, who runs the Pearson Health Technology Institute. She designed the organization. It's a $50 million organization designed to provide independent evaluations for digital health technologies. And they recently released their first report focused on solutions to help manage diabetes. The organization came into being last year, and so this is their first report in what will be a series of reports on different areas of healthcare. So I'm delighted to welcome Caroline here to talk about the organization and this report on diabetes solutions. She's going to share a presentation that goes through all of that, and then I'll moderate questions. If you have questions during the program, please use the Q&A function, and I will sort through that. And with that, thank you all for joining us. Thank you, especially Caroline, for joining us here. Really looking forward to your presentation and to this conversation.
Thanks so much, Stephen. I'm really delighted to be here. I'll pull up some slides and we'll get going. So I'll give you a little bit of background about the Peterson Health Technology Institute, why we launched and came to be, how we're working with folks across the digital health and healthcare industry, and then I'll give you a sense of the overview from our first report, as well as a preview of what's to come, but really want to make sure we leave plenty of time for Q&A, because I think it's incredibly valuable, and happy to answer any and all questions. So first and foremost, as Stephen mentioned, the Peterson Health Technology Institute is really an independent evaluator of health technologies and digital health tools, with a specific focus on how those solutions can improve healthcare outcomes in terms of health effectiveness and lower costs. And we are born out of the Peterson Center on Healthcare, which is a nonprofit philanthropy really dedicated to improving healthcare affordability and quality for all Americans. And the center has been around for almost 9 years. And we have long thought that technology has a critical role to play in advancing healthcare and driving forward our future. And so we were really excited about how digital solutions can improve efficiency, health outcomes, health equity, and patient experience across many different clinical areas. But we also looked around and felt like perhaps we weren't on the path that we needed to be. And we started off doing a lot of conversations. We spoke to about 200 folks across the industry. And one of the things that we heard over and over, particularly from health plans, employers, and large health systems, each of whom purchase digital health tools, was this real sense of being overwhelmed. The pandemic happened. We saw a significant and necessary adoption of digital health solutions and a huge influx of investment into that sector. But what has come with a few years of experience is that folks are really struggling to say, I'm not totally clear how to integrate these solutions together, right? We hear a lot about point solution fatigue. I don't necessarily have clear goals around what I'm hoping that these solutions are going to deliver to my patients or to my members. And I really am not convinced that I have evidence that these solutions are delivering on everything that was promised. And so, we thought there was an opportunity for philanthropy as a foundation to create these assessment reports that really do evidence-based reviews of the clinical effectiveness literature, as well as the economic analysis about how these solutions are affecting healthcare spending, and present those findings to the world in public reports that are freely available on our website. And so, as Steven mentioned, our first report came out towards the end of March and was focused on digital diabetes management solutions for people with type 2 diabetes. And we'll talk a bit more about that. But first, I want to really emphasize why we're doing this work. One of the things that we are hoping is going to come out of these evaluations is really increasing the connection between technologies that have fantastic evidence about their effectiveness and their efficiency and their ability to get market adoption. And today we think that connection between high value technologies with great evidence and their ability to get that adoption, it's not strong enough. And we just simply aren't able to efficiently sort wheat from chaff and really identify the solutions that are going to drive healthcare forward. And we do that through this set of efforts to really clarify what good evidence looks like. The digital health industry is not the same as the pharmaceutical industry. We recognize that not all solutions are going to have or need to have RCTs in order to demonstrate evidence. But we do want to set better evidence standards and help identify what is necessary to demonstrate value. Second, we want to do the work to really identify solutions that are working and that have the potential to save money over the long term. And our hope is that in doing so, we can actually speed up the purchasing process for those great technologies, as well as increase the acceptance by patients and providers who can feel more confident in their decisions to recommend or use those technologies. And so, our thesis is really built around trying to change behavior for digital health purchasers, those employers, health plans, and providers that I mentioned, because those are really the entities in the market that are making decisions about which technologies are available for many people through their insurance products. And as we talk to those purchasers, they really focus us on these three key questions on the right-hand side. They want to know, does this technology work? And importantly, for whom? We see that many solutions are being broadly distributed across patient populations or health plan membership, but we want to be able to figure out what are the bright spots for the patient subgroups who stand to benefit the most from the technology, so that we can really make sure that digital tools are getting into the hands of the people for whom they're going to work best. The second question is, are these solutions better than the status quo? And this is one that was somewhat controversial in some of our initial work, because we really have said, to the extent that digital health solutions are entering into an existing care model, whether it be layering on top of that care model or potentially replacing other forms of traditional in-person care, we want to know if those solutions are as good or better as the care that they're replacing, recognizing that there is widely varied approaches and access to usual care in today's market. And then third, we want to understand whether these solutions are lowering costs or have the potential to lower costs. And importantly here, we're not looking at a cost effectiveness model. we're really looking at budget impact over a 1 to 3 year time frame. And that's not because we don't recognize that health improvements can garner savings over much longer periods, as well as benefits to patients. But it is because in the sales cycle for these technologies, these companies are presenting ROI models and health economics models to these purchasers who are really making decisions on about that 3 year time frame, and they really want to understand what that impact is going to be. There may be situations where it makes a lot of sense to invest more and spend more for a high value solution that's going to improve health outcomes. But payers want to be clear about what that means when they're making that decision, because this is a situation where there really are trade-offs. And if a health plan or an employer chooses to adopt one technology, that is another technology that they may not be able to adopt. And so they really want to understand where value lies. Throughout our process, we are trying to be incredibly engaged with stakeholders across the industry. We have a purchaser advisory council that includes health plans, employers, and some providers that do not participate directly in our assessments in any way, but they do help us understand what information those purchasers are going to be looking for, the formats of the reports and outcomes that are going to be most helpful to them, and they really guide our strategic thinking throughout our approach. Then for each report, we recruit a team of clinical experts who can really help us understand not only how the digital solutions may work, but how they're adding into existing care environments. So they're helping us understand typical care patterns within the existing traditional market, how they change with the use of a digital health tool, and then really helping us look at some of the clinical outcomes that we're finding in the literature to understand what changes are meaningful and high impact for patients. Next, we work directly with patients. It's really important that we understand the patient voice throughout our process, and we conduct direct research through both interviews and focus groups with patients for each of our reports. And again, that's really helping us understand what matters to patients, what's challenging about their existing care models, and what their experience is with some of these solutions. Finally, any of the digital health companies that are included in our reports are given an opportunity to submit additional data and information, either clinical information or commercial and pricing data that is incorporated into our reports. It's important to say that our analysis is really a secondary analysis. We're not conducting any primary testing of these solutions, nor are we conducting original claims analysis or other evidence generation. Another way that we have worked with stakeholders is through our digital health collaborative. And this is really where we brought together leading healthcare and healthcare technology organizations, consumer organizations, and others in the industry who share a common commitment to this idea of raising the bar for evidence and value in digital health technology. And while we convene and help fund the digital health collaborative, they are not directly involved in the report generation either, but they do share our mission of ensuring that we continue to drive forward better quality evidence and evidence-driven purchasing decisions. On this slide, you can see the inaugural group of 14 members that are part of the collaborative, and that includes consumer organizations like AARP, the Digital Medicine Society, as well as NCQA, the American Medical Association, and many others. And this group is really working to think about how evidence and evidence-based purchasing of digital health is going to drive the future of innovation and ensure that we're delivering clinical benefits to every patient who's using these technologies, while also helping promote efficiency and scale in the market. So let me talk you through the highlights of our digital diabetes management report. First and foremost, why do we look at diabetes? We all understand that type 2 diabetes is a huge healthcare burden on people in this country, with growing prevalence each year, and a disproportionate burden of disease on a variety of underserved populations, including older adults and lower income individuals. We Also understand that the amount of self-management that people with type 2 diabetes need to do between visits is very significant. And so we've seen a tremendous amount of technology innovation in this space, with companies trying to help support patients with that self-management between their physician visits. Our analysis looked very specifically at digital diabetes management programs that were relying on non-continuous glucometers. And these really combine reminders, education, and coaching to try to ensure that patients are reliably measuring their blood glucose, taking their medication, and making the behavior and lifestyle changes that will help them control their blood glucose and improve their diabetes over time. We conducted our analysis looking at sort of 3 categories of solutions. One is the remote patient monitoring category, of which Gluco is one of the largest solution vendors that is specifically focused on diabetes, but of course there are many others in this category. These are solutions that are really selling directly to providers who are then billing through the remote patient monitoring codes for that additional patient oversight and glycemic measurement between those in-person physician visits. The second and the largest category is our behavior and lifestyle modification category. That is one that includes, the 6 companies that you see here, and they are generally selling to health plans or to employers, and then being provided directly to those patients, really, as I said, to augment existing care models rather than to replace any of the traditional physician care. The third category is really quite different, and that's nutritional ketosis, where Virta is the primary solution in the market today. And unlike the other 2 categories that generally are focused on helping with behavior change and glycemic control, Virta is really trying to guide patients through a very intensive dietary change of nutritional ketosis. And they have a specific aim of working to achieve diabetes remission at the end of their program. Across all of these categories, we have a variety of inclusion criteria, which you see at the bottom, including that companies need to have raised at least $25 million in investment funding. And that's really meant to be a proxy for the sort of maturity, size, and stability of some of these solutions. So what did we find? Generally, we were disappointed with the clinical outcomes that we saw in the evidence base. So when we look first at remote patient monitoring and behavior and lifestyle modification categories, we find that across all of the studies, we generally see that people with diabetes who are put on a care plan, even in usual care, tend to be able to improve their hemoglobin A1C over time. Now, hemoglobin A1C is the hallmark of diabetes management, and it is also a measure that tends to track with other important health outcomes like cardiovascular risks that are key to managing diabetes effectively. When we begin to look specifically at studies that show how people with the digital solutions compare to people receiving usual care without a digital solution, we generally see that the findings are incredibly tightly clustered. And this is notable because as a researcher, often you look at the data and because of study designs and population differences, results are scattered. But in fact, the vast majority of these studies showed that the digital solutions provided around a 0.2 to 0.4 percentage point improvement in hemoglobin A1C relative to people who received usual care. Now, the question is that a meaningful amount? And as we talk to our clinical advisors and we look at the literature, generally speaking, what we hear is that a 0.2 to a 0.4 percentage point reduction in hemoglobin A1C, assuming that folks are still in the sort of diabetic glucose range, those are not sufficient changes to materially alter folks' care plans, their long-term prognosis, or their healthcare spending. Moreover, what we saw is that the effects of the digital diabetes management solutions began to deteriorate over time. So when folks were given the solutions, they engaged with their apps, they responded to the reminders, you do see this slight improvement in their blood glucose in the initial period of about 3 to 6 months. However, between 6 and 12 months, we generally see the separation between the control arm and the intervention arm begin to erode, after which point the groups generally look about the same. And so generally what we see is that we're not finding clinically meaningful or durable benefits to hemoglobin A1C for folks that are using these solutions. When we look at secondary health outcomes, of which there are many important ones, including weight loss and cardiovascular risks, we did not find any consistent evidence that the digital diabetes management groups outperformed those who had a usual care plan. Now, I want to take a minute and talk about health equity, because as I mentioned, diabetes is absolutely a condition that disproportionately affects people of color and other underserved populations. And we recognize that those groups may also be less likely to have access to reliable, high-quality usual care. And we understand that technology is an important opportunity to close some of the existing care gaps in our delivery system. So we were very eager to see how these solutions were being deployed to some of these diverse groups and how they performed in those groups. Unfortunately, the evidence is incredibly thin here. Not only did the vast majority of studies that we reviewed not even report on the demographics of their population, but those that did revealed that these solutions are by and large being deployed to higher income, disproportionately white, and groups with relatively low starting hemoglobin A1C levels. So while we all understand that in fact there is a potential that these solutions may work to improve health equity, we simply don't see evidence of that, at least in today's literature base. Now, I would like to talk about two bright spots in the data. And the first is in our remote patient monitoring box here. There's one study where the digital solutions were provided to patients with high starting hemoglobin A1C, so people with more severe diabetes, who are newly beginning insulin. And in that study, the intervention group dramatically outperformed the control group, achieving a 1.2 percentage point greater reduction in hemoglobin A1C compared to usual care. And this makes sense to me. One of the things that's really hard about these diabetes tools is they're trying to create behavior change. We all understand that behavior change is incredibly difficult, particularly when people have established self-management routines. To the extent that we can catch patients at key transition points in their care, like when they're starting insulin, and use digital solutions to help them establish better care patterns, that may be a greater potential for improved outcomes. The second highlight that I want to mention is around VERTA and its nutritional ketosis program. The clinical results for VERTA, for people who are able to complete the VERTA program, were striking and incredibly positive. They had very significant rates of diabetes remission, which then led to improvements in cardiovascular outcomes and the ability to actually begin reducing or eliminating other diabetes medications. These are really impressive outcomes and things that we should be excited about, but it's also important to frame them in context. We understand that a nutritional ketosis diet is incredibly rigorous and going to be challenging for many patients. And it is not likely that this is going to be a solution for all people with type 2 diabetes. So while VERTA belongs as a piece of the puzzle in terms of solving type 2 diabetes, we need to keep searching for other solutions that are going to be more effective for all patients. This is the summary chart that we included in our report and certainly has gotten a lot of attention. And I think folks will see the comments from the prior slide reflected. But in general, based on the existing evidence base and across a broad patient population, we simply do not see clinical or economic evidence that suggests that these solutions should continue to be adopted. And that's incredibly disappointing. So what's next? Well, obviously we can't give up on technology-enabled diabetes care, and we want to continue to drive innovation towards solutions that are going to produce better outcomes. We understand that continuous glucose monitoring, CGMs, are a core part of many of these solution vendors are going. And they're increasingly building programs that really rely on CGMs. And they tell us that they're getting improved and impressive results from that greater amount of feedback. And we're really excited to look at the CGM-based models and conduct another evaluation as soon as the evidence is sufficient. The other thing that you can't not mention when talking about diabetes is, of course, the expansion of the GLP-1 market is going to really transform diabetes care, not just for digital solutions, but also for traditional care. And many of the companies that are in this report are already thinking carefully about how they can integrate GLP-1 management and adherence into their programs for better outcomes. But in general, I think what we are driving towards is the idea that good evidence matters. Good evidence is going to include a comparator group so that folks can really differentiate the incremental value of a digital solution. And that we need evidence that helps us to deploy these technologies, not necessarily broadly, but to the patient populations that are going to benefit the most at the times in their care journey where they have the most potential for improvement. So now what's next? We have an upcoming report coming out very soon on virtual musculoskeletal care. So these are comprehensive virtual solutions that generally include virtual PT at their core, along with other wraparound behavior change and care team models. After that, we're going to have a digital hypertension management report. And that's going to be very interesting because many of those technologies and interventions are very similar to the diabetes solutions that I just mentioned. But hypertension is a very different condition than diabetes. It is one that both relies more on medication management than some of the behavior change. And it tends to rely on more intensive periods of provider engagement while folks are trying to get their blood pressure back under control. And so versus very long-term chronic conditions, this tends to be a little bit shorter term in terms of how the diabetes or how the hypertension interventions need to be structured. And then before the end of the year, we'll be tackling a very specific to be defined slice of the very broad virtual care market for depression and anxiety. And we're excited to bring those findings to everyone. So with that, I am going to pull my screen share down, and Steven is back, and I'm excited to answer any questions.
Well, Caroline, thank you so much. Thanks for walking through that and sharing both the background on the organization as well as the report that you just in March released your first report. I mean, congratulations on releasing your first report, but so what you just, I mean, I have 1,000 questions, but I'm going to try to, what you just delivered is a summary of what the report was, which is a pretty scathing indictment in a sense of these diabetes solutions that are out there. And I've certainly heard by proxy the whole digital health kind of industry and enterprise overall. And so I want to just sort of probe a little bit and get your sense of some of that, because I know you kind of touched on it high level, but you have an extremely rigorous methodology, and you kind of knew what you were wading into, that and we're certainly not taking it lightly at all. And I don't think your intention in starting out was like, we're going to just produce a scathing report and whatever. I think you were trying to pick a solution that is really important, that's a big part of healthcare, both from a cost perspective and from a number of patients and outcomes, and figure out what's out there. But sort of a few questions to just dig in. So first of all, you talked a lot about the evidence and effectively that with one exception, the solutions that you looked at don't work, even putting aside the cost implications. What did you look at for evidence? Is it all publicly available data? Did the companies send you stuff? I mean, I know I can't speak for all these companies, but I know some of them certainly make statements, or I don't know if they rise to the level of formal claims, but that they are more effective than what you just showed there. And so how do you reconcile that? Where does your data come from? What was that analysis process? What did that look like?
Yeah. So all of the data that we used is publicly available. In this report, it turned out to be all publicly available data. And so it's data that's published, some of it's published in peer-reviewed journals, some of it's posters and abstracts. It's all out in the public domain. We did have number of companies did participate and did send us additional information, but a lot of that was things that turned up in the literature review. And I think what's important is most of the data that we reviewed is evidence that was produced by these companies with these particular solutions. So we're all looking at the same set of data. I think one of the things that is distinct about our analysis and has created a little confusion about some of the results and sort of who said what, is this comparison to usual care. Many of the companies in how they communicate about their benefits really talk about hemoglobin A1C improvements over time. And that's great, right? We want to see hemoglobin A1C improvements over time. But what we see consistently in the evidence base is actually folks receiving usual care who go to a physician and get sent home with a glucometer and a care plan also improve their hemoglobin A1C over time. And what's important about this report is really sort of how these solutions are layering into that care model. And in this case, they're adding on top of it, right? We're paying extra to give someone a digital solution. And so we believe that they should be achieving better clinical outcomes than they would without it. And so that's really the kind of very specific frame that we brought to what is a publicly available and sort of widely agreed upon evidence base.
So I think that's a really interesting sort of insight that you just said. So effectively, what you're doing is comparing the standard of care, and what a lot of the marketing that comes out from the companies may be not necessarily doing that. And that could explain the difference there.
That's definitely where some of the numbers don't line up, because we've got those numbers too. We've got all the same numbers. I will just caveat, I'm careful to say usual care. So standard of care is recommended best-in-class care. We understand that usual care is a whole heterogeneous mix of care that may be not what is recommended as standard care. And so that's generally what we're comparing to. Although, of course, the studies are usually, while they have a variety of care models as their usual care, it's, of course, good care.
So I'm not going to go farther than this one question down a rabbit hole, but because there's a lot of other questions and people are putting questions in the Q&A that I want to get to. But like when I think about drug companies and trials and my own time in the pharma industry and think there were times where we would compare therapeutic interventions to the standard of care, and because that's a thing, and so you can compare against it. Whereas usual care, as you just sort of said, is kind of mushy. And so what are you comparing? So how are you sure that you're comparing apples to apples? Are you because it sounds like that usual care isn't part of the studies that these companies are doing, that's sort of a bogey that you have out here that you're then measuring their performance against, or am I missing something?
Sorry, we really looked at all the studies, and then we looked at a subset of studies that had both a usual care and a comparator arm. So they're built into the studies, and they are done by the companies. And then what you can do is say, well, is the longitudinal change, the sort of not compared to usual care improvements that we're seeing, consistent with the studies that don't have a comparison arm? And they actually all are. All of the data lines up in this particular report relatively consistently. And then one last thing that I'll make before we maybe pivot from evidence, which is I do want to reemphasize, because you mentioned drugs, these were not all RCTs. We looked at about 60% of the studies in our analysis were real-world evidence based on a variety of observational trial designs, and including retrospective designs. So, we recognize that those are important ways to generate evidence that are going to be more efficient and honestly more real-world than, just an RCT model.
Got it. I'll sort of maybe go back and forth between questions that have come in and other questions that I'm dying to ask you. But there's some questions in here about, did you evaluate effectively they're asking, did you evaluate the user experience? And if somebody's using one of these solutions and just finds them really annoying, did you do any sort of analysis of that, of like, here's what a solution looks like that performs better in terms of retention or engagement or user experience, or was that sort of not directly in the purview of what you were looking at, and you were really more focused on the things you outlined of ultimately, do they work and do you see the results and the cost implications?
So we definitely looked at user experience. It's a core part of our analysis. And there's actually a pretty good literature base around user experience. I mean, many of these companies have done really good evidence generation for their own benefit, right? To understand what really works and what keeps folks engaged. And there's a variety of metrics that you can look at, around, adherence, around just sort of measures of actual engagement with the application, and then satisfaction. And so, we looked at that full evidence base. It's hard to, I think it's generally a pretty positive evidence base, folks sort of from a satisfaction point of view. But, we do then tie it back to the clinical outcomes, because I think it's great that a patient likes an app, but we want them to like and engage with the app enough that we get the clinical outcomes that we're seeking. And so we do really think that user experience and the clinical outcomes really tie together for the ultimate purpose of these solutions.
Yeah. Do you have a conclusion that, you've been immersed in this world of diabetes solutions, presumably for a long time, and looking at all this data and looking at the solutions, do you have obviously your conclusion is that they're not working. Do you have a point of view on, is it that they really don't work and there isn't sort of inherent value in this type of an intervention? Or is it that the companies are either not investing enough into clinical research to demonstrate that they work, or aren't focused on necessarily the right kind of endpoints in their research, or that there's something, if they could sort of recharacterize their research, that actually it looks like there's a lot of value here, they just haven't proven it yet? Or that, because kind of listening to what you were saying, it's sort of like, okay, this is a category we should just sort of like put on the shelf and wait for another generation of solutions. Where do you fall on that spectrum?
Well, let's be clear. The next generation of solutions is already coming, right? These companies, first of all, I think, every company in this report is well-intentioned and trying to deliver value to patients. I 100% believe that. And, this is, while diabetes solutions are some of the oldest digital health tools, it's still a relatively young industry, right? So we've done a lot in terms of figuring out how do we engage people, how do we build out products, that work. But we do have to, as an industry, hold ourselves accountable for then seeing that we're getting the results that we're all hoping for. And, at least in the sort of initial round of evidence that we look at, we're not seeing, clinical outcomes that are good enough for me, in broad strokes. And so I think there's a few things. One, certainly 2.0 products are going to hone in, whether it be CGM, whether it be GLP-1s or something else that I haven't thought of. They're continuing to try to do better and to innovate, and that's great. We should invest in that. And then two is really thinking about how do we produce better, more specific evidence. There's been a lot of folks who have said, look, folks with higher hemoglobin A1C who don't have access to great usual care have much more potential for these solutions to help them. And that, of course, makes sense. So let's put these tools in the hands of those folks and let's measure those outcomes. I think it's really kind of about both focus on who and when in their care journey is going to benefit. It's about continuing to innovate. And it's just about holding ourselves accountable as we, to the evidence base as we do that. And I think all these companies will, and they are. But that's what we owe to patients.
So I realize it's relatively early since the report came out. It sort of made a big splash. People have been talking about it. What is at least the early response that you're getting? And I'm interested in entrepreneurs, investors, payers, providers, employers, both in terms of, I'm sure you've heard an earful from all of them, and but also whether you've kind of observed any changes in behaviors from any of those kind of groups, one way, in some direction.
Yeah, let's take them one by one. So, I think first on the payer side, whether it be health plans or employers, we have just heard this universal sense of thank you. We've heard folks say, this is what I've been seeing in my data, but I haven't had any external sources to validate it. Or, this is really what I have suspected, but I wasn't sure. And we want to make, and those folks are also well-intentioned, and they're saying, look, I only have bandwidth to bring on so many solutions to my platform in a given year. And so I want to really think about which ones are really helping people get better. So, it's been a really positive response from that group, and I think more action-oriented. They've said, we've got renewals coming up. We're going to use this information as part of our future decision making. So that's been great. I think on the investor side, we thought investors might be a little slower to the party, wait and see if we were going to have an effect. But we have heard from many investors who have said, this is clearly where the market is going, right? It's clear we're clearly going to move to a more rigorous evidence-based value proposition. And frankly, to the extent that we can understand what purchasers are going to make decisions based on, so that we know what evidence to generate and that's going to be compelling to them, we want to understand that as quickly as possible. So we've heard tremendous engagement from the investor community, basically saying, help us design a path both to diligence our investments and to guide our companies in our portfolios. The reaction from the industry has obviously been more mixed. Certainly, this is hard news for the companies that were named in the report, and we've been in pretty regular touch with a number of them, as well as reading their reactions on the internet. But one of the things that has been helpful for me is to hear that even many of those companies and others who are sort of digital health spokespeople, folks that don't like the report still say, what, this is driving forward the conversation, right? And this is sort of a maturity moment for the industry, and that's great. I mean, not everyone is going to agree with us, but if it is generating a real robust dialogue about evidence and outcomes, I think that's a really positive result. And then what's been interesting is for companies that were not in the diabetes space, but potentially in some of the other categories that we have on our list or others, they're dying to talk to us. So we're getting a lot of inbound from companies who say, we've got great evidence, let us tell you about it. And that's been, really welcome and a really positive dialogue.
How do you view so in drugs, they all go through the FDA. There's a process. It's a pathway that's been established over decades. There's a whole thing there. And then what comes out the other end, and then there's fights over reimbursement and costs and things like that. But in terms of a process for evaluating the safety and efficacy of solutions, it's pretty much what it is, and that goes through the FDA in the United States. There isn't that, obviously, for most digital health solutions. The FDA does look at some, but most of them, they don't. How have you, like going forward, is the idea that we should think about PHTI as sort of a proxy for the FDA? Because also, frankly, I don't think anybody wants the FDA to review every single. And I don't think that would, can't imagine they would want to. I don't think it would be appropriate. But, should we think about PHTI as kind of a proxy in a sense for what the imprimatur that the FDA puts behind the reviews that it does of drugs and, to a certain extent, devices and diagnostics?
Well, I would never compare PHTI to the FDA. So the official answer there is no. But I think given that this is an area that isn't heavily regulated and probably shouldn't be, and shouldn't have that kind of review process, I do think that having these independent sources of evidence-backed information that folks can rely on and form their own opinions about is really valuable to the market. And that's certainly, that's what our aim is. And we did a comprehensive report. We've got an 80-page appendix. We've tried to just put the information out there so that folks can really read the conclusions, but keep reading, right? There's a lot of nuance. People will come to their own decisions, but at least trying to make that easy for them. I mean, as you mentioned, it's a big process. This report took us probably 8 or 9 months. And it's not possible for everybody across the industry to do that independently. And so if we can create some economies of scale and create some clarity, I think that's beneficial.
All right, maybe a kind of a rapid fire. There's a lot of questions in here that are coming that I think are very specific, and so let me go through under some of them are about your methodology, some about kind of things you looked at, how you looked at them. One of them, did you quantify the total amount of the question characterizes it as waste, but the spend at least that employers have paid for these services and kind of what that looks like?
I wish I had that number. Our report includes a number which is sort of 58 billion in terms of total investment and M&A activity in this space. But obviously that doesn't relate to sort of what payers have paid. And I wish I had that number, but I don't.
Did any of these solutions provide healthcare professionals with data or adherence information or that they wouldn't have otherwise had that then allow them to provide a different kind of a care process that without these solutions they wouldn't have? Did you kind of look underneath and provide any assessment of things like that?
So I think that's going to be most relevant for the RPM category, which is really explicitly built around sharing data back with providers. And I think it's an important flag. So, the RPM technologies are only going to be as good as any given provider practice is using that information, right? That's an information vehicle. Gluco has a lot of wraparound educational components that are sort of patient facing, but fundamentally, I'm sure that there are clinical practices out there using RPM data and modifying their care effectively based on it. So, it's not that there's not pockets of those bright spots, but we're just not seeing that in the sort of broad-based evidence for that category.
Got it. Did you do analyses stratifying any stratification? I think the answer is going to be no, but did you do any stratification of people who are participating in these studies who kind of valued the digital intervention versus those who didn't value it? Like, did you go in and sort of pull out segments and say, this for this subset of the population can really be beneficial, for this subset, not so much?
The easiest way, the best way to do that in the data is really for some studies, you can see results both for completers, folks that sort of went through the whole study with it and met their engagement metrics, and then the intent to treat population. And you can look at the differences, and there's always fall off there. But I don't think that we saw as much spread in those results as the question might imply exists.
Interesting. What's the relationship between PHTI and ICER?
ICER is a prominent HTA organization for prescription drugs. They have been doing this work for a long time. And so we worked with them when we set out to create our assessment framework, because we knew we were new to this and they were very experienced. So we created a custom framework for digital health in partnership with ICER. And we use that framework to guide our analysis, but they are not conducting the analysis or involved in any of our sort of day-to-day evaluations.
You touched on this at the beginning, but maybe you could just clarify. Maybe some people weren't on for the first few minutes or not, but what is, who's funding all of this? What's the business model that how are you making money? Who are you making money from? How does that work?
Great. No business model, no money. So we're a foundation. And we have an endowment that funds all of our work, and that came out of the Peterson Center on Healthcare. We don't accept any outside donations to the foundation. We don't accept any money from anyone throughout the healthcare industry, whether that be the Purchaser Advisory Council or the companies that are reviewed. And we think that really contributes to our independence. There's a lot of assessors out there that claim to be independent, but are pay-to-play models, and I believe we're the only ones who aren't. And so I think that really drives a different conversation.
It's an interesting question. Understanding your reports are retrospectively looking at solutions is sort of inherently by your methodology. They're looking retrospectively at solutions and data. Is it possible to tease out from what you did questions or approaches to value creation that entrepreneurs and innovators should think about as they build their solutions? So effectively, is there a roadmap embedded in what you've done for entrepreneurs look forward looking?
We hope so. That's the whole point, is not just to rehash the past, but to really sort of be clear on what has worked and what hasn't, and therefore where do we move on? At the back of the reports, there's a next steps section that has some recommendations for entrepreneurs, for health plans and other purchasers, and for providers and patients. And so we're trying to give that forward guidance to the extent that we both can discern it from the evidence and can hear it from our engagement with the companies in the space.
Were there criteria around the size of study? There's a question about your analyses and sort of the sizes of these programs or presumably these studies. Like, did you differentiate? Presumably not all of the studies had a similar size patient population. How did you weight those? How did you take that into consideration?
Yeah, so there wasn't any exclusion criteria based on study size. Each of the studies was reviewed for quality and risk of bias, and that's all. And then the sample size and everything else about the study designs are all available in our appendix at great detail. But certainly we understand, and then of course, like the size of the study is going to affect the statistical outcomes in terms of the power that it's got behind the design. But we didn't explicitly weight. In the future, it is likely that we will do sort of statistical meta-analysis, which is what I think the nature of the question is. Honestly, in this case, the results all lined up so tightly, it really wasn't necessary because we didn't need to calibrate based on the study size or design otherwise.
Interesting. There's a question on health equity. Does PHTI intend to address the health equity issue by enabling testing of these solutions with underserved populations? And maybe if I can take that, but extrapolate it a little bit. Do you see a future where PHTI is doing testing, or is PHTI really set up as an organization to evaluate what other people have done?
It's the latter. We're not set up at this time to do our own testing. We get a lot of requests to do that, so who knows what the future will hold. But right now, that's not at all within our scope. And so really, our idea is if we can shine a light on the opportunity for health equity and the evidence base, whether it be strong or otherwise, around health equity, hopefully we drive sort of demand for that evidence, but we won't be generating it ourselves.
Do you have an opinion on the tightening of HbA1c guidelines, the pre-diabetic numbers? It's specifically pre-diabetic 5.9 versus 6.5, diabetic 6.5. No, but is that something you have a?
I'm not a clinician, so I definitely don't have an opinion on the tightening of the guidelines. We're really working in our reports off of whatever the sort of current and best-in-class guidelines are, and the pre-diabetes was not part of our scope. I should emphasize, in addition to CGM, many of these companies do focus on pre-diabetes population, and that's really materially different and wasn't something that we looked at.
All right, so you've got your musculoskeletal conditions or care report coming out imminently, I think, or sometime in the very near future. You mentioned two others that you're working on. As I understand it, you've got a whole, I don't know how firm the topics are, but this is like you're in this for the long haul, and there's going to be lots of things that you're working on. What is your advice for entrepreneurs who are building companies and a lot of them think that they have evidence, or they do have evidence, but how should they be thinking differently in your eyes about the development of their solutions given what you're doing?
Well, I think my hope is, when you look at sort of the evidence, even in this report that was generated, I mean, the number of outcomes that folks are trying to generate evidence against right now is so high because they don't know what matters, right? Should I be focused on patient satisfaction? Am I focused on weight loss? Am I focused on presenteeism or absenteeism, which will be certainly relevant in the MSK report for employers? And so I think to the extent that we can help continue to clarify sort of like what are evidence standards, how do you focus on primary health outcomes? And then how do you design studies to be able to do them efficiently and in ways that are going to produce compelling results? I think that will hopefully help speed that process for entrepreneurs who I think are well intended and probably a little lost right now because the market is muddled at the moment.
The market is muddled at the moment. Um, I think that just to maybe close it out and sort of reiterate, uh, your first report came out and again is a pretty scathing, throws a lot of cold water on a particular sector of digital health, but in some sense, it that spilled over to digital health generally, which has been under some amount of criticism earned for quite a while, that there's a lot of noise out there. There's a lot of solutions that don't have a lot of evidence. And so I don't think that your intention with creating this institute and going into it is to sort of squash what is a relatively nascent industry with I believe an enormous amount of potential to improve health. I think your aspiration is to reshape a little bit about how it gets developed to allow for more intelligent decisions. Is that a fair characterization?
I think that's a great characterization. I mean, I think, the digital health industry of today is just healthcare of tomorrow. And we really believe that technology is going to be the backbone of all of the way that we receive care in the future. And we want to see ourselves realize the best and fastest, innovation trajectory there. And so, I can't wait to release a positive report and to highlight some of the fantastic technology that's out there, and hopefully drive faster adoption of it for purchasers.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much, Caroline, for joining us, for sharing, for responding to a lot of these questions. Really appreciate it. Best of luck as you continue this journey that you're on. For the audience, if you enjoyed this, our next event is on May 22nd. I mentioned at the top that we're running an accelerator for companies focused on improving maternal health in the United States. You'll hear from the 10 companies on May 22nd, both in person at Matter or virtually. You can learn about all our events at matter.health/events. And thank you all for joining. And Carolyn, thank you yet again.
Thanks so much. Happy to be here.